Judgment is a complicated word, right? Is a very complex word. And when I mean judgment, I mean that righteous divine judgment, right? The judgment of God, right? Rather than the judgment of, like I could say, I'm going to go down that path rather than that path. It's unemotional, it's unentangled. But there is this righteous judgment that comes in that creates such a fertile ground for entanglement that we can start saying, I don't judge you, because if I judge you, I place myself higher than you, therefore being in a place where I'm going to repeat that pattern.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to my podcast. Do you like my background? My new background. I'm pretty happy with it. So today I had a guest named John Acosta. He's a military veteran, a father, and a business leader. He works in family constellations, which deals with generational trauma. It was so interesting. I was very enthusiastic about this. It was so interesting. We started the podcast with a meditation, 5-minute meditation, not a long meditation, but a good meditation, I think. I think a very good visualization for everyone. And then we got into the nuts and bolts of his life and what he's doing and how it can impact individuals, families, society, political systems. Like, it's pretty cool. So I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for tuning in.
I'll invite you to close your eyes, uncross your arms and legs, and ground your feet to the floor. Feel the weight of your body where you are. Now we're going to take 3 deep breaths. Take 1 deep breath for you. In through your nose. And out through your mouth. Now 1 for your mother. In and out. Now 1 for your father. Inhale. And exhale. Now see your mother behind your left shoulder, close to your heart, supporting you. Even if you do not know your mother, or you had a difficult relationship with her, be in gratitude to her for bringing you into this world. Feel her presence. Now see your father behind your right shoulder. Supporting you. Feel his presence. Now see your mother's parents behind her on each side. And your father's parents behind him. And your great-grandparents behind them. Now see all your ancestors standing behind you. Invite all the excluded ones to join them. See the warm glow, cascading life force, experience, intuition, and ancient knowledge coming towards you. Feel their presence supporting you moving forward. Sit in that feeling for a moment. Now when you're ready, come back to the space.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, John, can you explain to me the concept of family constellations? So we were just looking at the family constellation. So let's talk about that and why it's undeniably important in understanding an individual's behavior.
That's such a good question. In family constellations, what the work does is that it reveals hidden dynamic in the family systems, and that we are not only representations of ourselves, but we're representations of everything that happened before us as well. That we all come from a mom and a dad, right? Regardless of, unless you're immaculately conceived, that I would love to meet you, right? We all come from two people, and that those people came from two people, and that those people came from two people, and that out of loyalty to our family system, we carry burdens that don't belong to us. And what family constellations do in a workshop setting is uncover hidden dynamics of burdens in the family system. If you've ever met somebody that is repeating a pattern in a family system, some people say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
I think we all do that.
Right?
To some extent.
To some extent, yeah. And those hidden loyalties can be constructive things or destructive things, right? It's
right.
In order for me to be part of the system, I have to be emotionally unavailable because my mother was emotionally unavailable and her mother was emotionally unavailable.
Right.
In order to be part of this family system, I have to either be a recipient of abuse or be the perpetrator. And so these hidden dynamics are these hidden acknowledgments that we have that repeat. And what this work does is uncover those hidden dynamics in a workshop fashion.
Yeah. Well, I asked you to be on my podcast because I should tell you this. I think my daughter and her husband listened to a sermon on generational trauma and also private, what do you call them, covenants that you've made. I can't remember what they're called exactly, but for my instance, it was something like that. When I left home when I was 18, I was the last one to leave. So my siblings had left 5 and 8 years before me. So I was at home with my mom and dad for the last 5 years and got to know them very well, but could not understand them and didn't feel like I got the attention that I needed. And so when I left that day, I told them I would never come back. And I didn't know what I was saying when I said it. I didn't know the gravity of what I was saying. And then in the future years, like just in this sermon, when listening to it, I realized that some of the decisions I made in future years, I could have looked to my sisters and my mother for guidance, and I didn't. Sometimes I went to diagnosed with illness, went to the hospital, was treated and went home before I told anybody. Yeah. And so And so then I went through this process of forgiving and forgiving them, forgiving myself, forgiving them, and then loving them, also loving them, which I've done a lot of work already on. So it was not foreign to me. And it was very good. It's very good.
That process is so powerful because rather than judging our parents, we begin to understand them.
Yeah.
And we can understand that they were also people
They're
that didn't
broken. We're
receive.
all broken, right?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so what in this work of family constellations and the beginning that we were doing that meditation is like, even if you, regardless of the circumstances of you, how you came to be, because there's a wide range of what that looks like. It could be a loving relationship or a horrific relationship and anything in between, right?
Oh, now
That
it
we
could
can
be IVF where you don't
exactly.
know. So then you grow
Exactly.
up and you have no idea.
It further complicates things, right?
Yes.
And you
right.
can be in a position to say simply, thank you for giving me life.
Right.
And that's it, without judgment, without the entanglements, without all the stories that we talk about. We can simply say from a place of because when judgment is a complicated word, right? Is a very complex word. And when I mean judgment, I mean that righteous divine judgment, right? The judgment of God, right? Rather than the judgment of like I could say, I'm going to go down that path rather than that path. It's unemotional, it's unentangled. But there is this righteous judgment that comes in that creates such a fertile ground for entanglement that we can start saying, I guess, maybe I wouldn't parent like you did, but that's it. Simply leaving it as it is, right? He said, I don't judge you because if I judge you, I place myself higher than you, therefore being in a place where I'm going to repeat that pattern. And so you can say, I can have my opinion and I can create a little bit of distance and I can go away from it or get closer to it, but I don't have that righteous judgment. I think a lot of our current politics comes from that dynamic of this righteous judgment that we place ourselves in the throne of God. Like we're no one to judge. Judgment is between you and your creator. And that's your business. My opinion is that I'm not going to put myself in a situation again for this to continue to happen.
Now, why would I want to do that? Go through that process, do you think? What kind of changes would it bring in my life?
So that's interesting. So what happens is until, Carl Jung talks about this is like, until we make the unseen seen, we will call it destiny, right? And we will call it fate, and it really is destiny. And there's this hidden undercurrent in the family system that we're like repeating this addiction pattern, that repeating what this looks like, right? And say, out of loyalty to you, I'm going to carry this burden. And there's an author. There was a book in 1973. It's I butcher the name, but it's I'll have to look it up. But it's Sparks and it's Bors Munyi Nagy and Sparks talk about this invisible loyalties and reciprocity in intergenerational families.
Right.
And there's this hidden cultural dynamic that bounds the family together. And we can say, in honor to you, I'm going to give back this burden, and I'm not going to repeat this pattern. So the pattern simply dissolves in the family system in a very phenomenological way. It's so odd. It doesn't make any logical sense, but the behavior that we're doing lacks all the logic in the world, right? Because somebody that's caring for a child wouldn't necessarily abandon them. But if there's abandonment in the family system over and over again, and it's intergenerational trauma, we can put ourselves in a situation where we can break those patterns.
What kind of things happen if there's unresolved trauma?
So, we see these patterns that emerge in the family system that are abandonment, right? And we can show our connection and our belonging in the family system by doing it differently, right? And one of the phrases that we talk about in family constellations is, this burden I give back to where it belongs. It no longer serves me. And please bless me to do it differently. And we, in honor to our family system, we can pass on life, which is one of the most powerful thing that we can do as a human being is to pass on life to another generation.
Yes, for sure. And
right?
You have little children, right?
And so yes, I have an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old.
And that
we're very blessed.
That makes it really important.
Yes, it's the most important thing that I can do as a father. and I use an expletive for this, and I don't know if cursing is allowed here, but I say work on your S is basically so they don't have to
Work
deal
on
with
your
my
spirituality, you
crap.
mean?
No, the expletive of the S word.
Oh.
Right? I approach this from a very masculine perspective.
I see.
This work
Pretty
is very
straightforward and
woo,
blunt,
right? Is very like work on
Crap.
your, crap, for lack of a better term. And so my children don't have to deal with my crap.
Yeah,
They can deal with their
right,
own.
right. Isn't that
That's
what
it,
we want?
right? That's what we
If
want,
we
is that they can make their own
think about
mistakes.
it, yeah. Like, who wouldn't want that?
Exactly. And out of loyalty to me, and to my wife, my children aren't repeating this pattern, or to their grandparents, or to, there was a child that we lost, and that we lost a child, that child is not acknowledged in the family system, that doesn't have their place, right? That there might be, that we see this in Constellations a lot, is that there may be, a child that was born, and then 2 pregnancies that were lost, and then another child that was born, and then a pregnancy that was lost. It's like, really, you have, 4 children or 5 children, and everybody has their place. And when they're not acknowledged and not talked about in the family system, we take on burdens that don't belong to us in order to acknowledge that hidden dynamic in the family system.
The other day I woke up and I got a flash of the hospital because I was so sick in 2019. And my husband said, what else do you see? Detail that. Get whatever you can from that image that you see. And so I described everything I saw, but then it went to we'd been renovating our house when I got so ill. So then we ended up living in Airbnbs, but I was sick in all those Airbnbs. So then I had to remember all those Airbnbs, and I'd even forgotten one, right? So I've recounted my illness a number of times, but I hadn't recounted the experience of living kind of a normal life. It wasn't, but what did that entail? And so to see all of that and to go through it. And so I'm going home in a few days, and I'm going to go back to that hospital and go into the rooms that I spent time praying and things like that. I'm going to go with the lady who brought me a rosary. So we're going to walk through together.
Oh, wow.
I don't know what you think of all of this, but this is my plan and it would be really good actually to go and walk to these Airbnbs and just stand in front of them.
It's almost a pilgrimage. It's like a pilgrimage to the gift of healing.
And I want to be able to carry forward being unencumbered.
And there's, like, what a gift.
To be alive?
To go through that, right? Yeah. To go through that process and the opportunities and dynamics that illness uncovers.
Right.
And that's, it's like when you experience loss and you experience illness, and such a great thing is like, and I'll get emotional talking about this. We lost a lot of family members in a short period of time. And so much of the healing came from, in my family system, so much of the healing came from those very difficult times.
Yeah.
That we were able to just see the gifts, that, oh man, I'll get emotional, but that we were able to see the gifts in those things, right? And it's like, and be grateful, and from a place of grace rather from a place of, why was I burdened from this? It's just such a beautiful process to go through that. And it's made me a better human to have experienced loss and to experience people going through it. It's just, there's such profound depth, there's so much depth to that process. And when you're able to look at it from a place of gratitude,
how did you manage to get there? Because it took me a life-threatening experience to get me on my knees, right? What brought you to this place that you can be grateful? Because I was grateful for my illness. So how'd you get there?
A very traumatic childhood.
I see. So that's what brought you to this work.
That's what brought me to this work. Yeah. So I struggled with suicide at a very young age, very young age. And went through, and I very rudderless when I was growing up. I was a terrible student, very rebellious and kind of a piece of work. Right. I was a charming kid, but also people were like, man, I was like that charming kid that people were like rooting for, but also knew that was very difficult. Like my parents got divorced. It was pretty traumatic, and we had nothing. We grew up in a very affluent area in Venezuela, in an affluent family, but we had nothing. Like literally, like begging the electricity company not to cut off our power, and we didn't have water for times, and just very.
And so
very
when
difficult.
was that time in Venezuela historically?
Like 1998.
And what was happening there then?
98, 97. Venezuela was doing relatively well. It was I'd enjoyed 40, 50 years of democracy. And so my mother is American. My mom's from Michigan, and she was a U.S. diplomat. She worked for the embassy in Venezuela, so we were very involved in like the political strife that was happening in Venezuela. And then she became a Foreign Service officer for the U.S. Department of Commerce. And we basically in 2002, my dad had left, and in 2002, I'd graduated from high school out of the skin of my teeth, basically. They're like, get this guy out of here, basically. And we moved to Mexico, and I was furious. Like I had a level of anger that's not appropriate, right? It's like not appropriate for a young man to have that many fights, and I was hanging out with the wrong group of guys, just kind of riffraff type of person. And we left with our, just kind of the clothes that we had on our backs to Mexico. And I lived in northern Mexico, and I was furious, just like furious that I had to leave the country where I was from. That I was furious at my father, didn't understand anything. I was furious at my mother. I was just angry at the world.
So your mother was in financial trouble once your dad left? Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's common in marriage. That often.
Yeah. And I became the man of the house, as they would say. And
Did you have siblings too?
Yes, I have a younger sister.
And you were the
eldest.
I have
a sister that I'm.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. And so I was like, why am I in this position? I have these, I have my own needs that I couldn't express, that I didn't have met. Right. And my father basically left me like, you're the man of the house. Here's a shotgun, and here's a 9mm. And we lived in this humongous house, and I had to protect the house. And so I would be like left for long weekends at the house, and I'd have to like protect it in some capacity, because break-ins in Venezuela are very very.
But once
common
you live under a communist regime, everything changes because. This is what I'm thinking. I'm thinking once there's a communist regime, people learn how to get around the system. So, because you have to. And then when it's democratic, they still know how to get around the system, so that it will be there in the society as a layer always.
Yeah. And Venezuela was like, had both worlds, right? It's like you would have, we grew up in a democratic process, and then Chavez came into power in 2002. And that was the transition of me from childhood into being a young man. And so there was just so much resentment of that. And, they were through the government while I was there. So just a lot of insecurity, and just layers and layers of trauma on that side. And, it's like, you're the man of the house, and you have to protect the house. And I'm protecting the house in some capacity with a shotgun. And I was suicidal at the time. So it was like, it was catastrophic.
I have to do this? You must have been asking, why me? Right? You must have been asking that.
Yeah. It's like, what did I do, right, to do this stuff? And it's very much now I'm aware that very much in the victim ideology, right? It's like very, like I didn't have a girlfriend, and I couldn't have, it's like very in the angry victimhood position in a very dark way as well. Right. And, understanding about, being violent towards myself and
no self-care, no good self-care.
No self-care whatsoever, just very, very, very just destructive against myself. And then from there, I joined the military, and the military gave me the father figure structure that I needed, right? I was like, you are catastrophically rudderless, right? You don't have a north.
How did you find your way to the army?
So this is an odd story. We lived in Monterrey, Mexico, and we would cross the border to McAllen, Texas. And we would go there for like shopping or stuff. And my cousin had joined the Navy. And then I'm like, I was talking to my best friend, and he was going to University of Florida. He's from Venezuela as well. He was going to University of Florida. Venezuela is very much intertwined with the United States, in many capacities. A lot of people come to Miami, and it's like Miami is the capital of Latin America, as they would say. So he was going to University of Florida, and he was like, man, come to University of Florida. Let's do, and he's like, we're partying and we're doing all this stuff. And I'm like, if I go to University of Florida, I'm not going to come back. It's not going to be a good combination. And my cousin had joined the Navy, and the Navy office was literally full. And this was post 9/11. And I'm like, I'll join the Air Force. So I walk into the Air Force office, did my ASVAB. And I was like, what do you want to do? I was like, whatever kind of situation. It wasn't out of, a lot of people are like honor and duty and all. So I was like, I didn't have anything to do. So I went into the military, and it just created structure for me. It created that I don't know, paternal infrastructure. And I had incredible mentors, and I worked really hard, gave me something to do, gave me purpose. And I really loved it. And this is kind of, the story gets even crazier, right? And the long way of answering your question is, so my mom, after my dad had a boyfriend that was killed in a car accident, head-on collision. And, she calls me, and my mom's Foreign Service officer, and she was in Mexico. I'd been stationed in England at the time, and she goes to Romania, and her boyfriend had been killed in this tragic accident. And she was going to a therapist at the time dealing with the grief. And she's like, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to deal with this. Right. And he said, there's this workshop that it's called the Family Constellation. Would you be interested in going? And so she went to this hotel in the Carpathian Mountains and near Brasov, and, former communist building, and does this week-long workshop with around 50 Romanian psychologists that brought this family constellation facilitator, this doctor, in to facilitate this work. My sister had done it the second year, and then the third year they convinced me to go. So I was like dating all the wrong women, like in the military. Now I'm like dating all the wrong women, doing the same thing over and over and over again, partying way too hard, drinking way too much, doing all this stuff, right? And I was dating the same woman over and over again, right? It's like this pattern that I had. And
when you're jilted 10 times, maybe it's not them, it's you.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, who's the problem here, right?
Yeah.
So if everywhere you go smells like crap, you should check your shoes kind of situation, right? So it was definitely that. And I experienced this incredible transformation. I was 26 years old at the time. And this was 16 years ago. And I immediately saw this work, and it was 55 Romanian psychologists and psychiatrists. And if you know a little bit about the history of Romania, there's deep societal wounds.
That's right.
In the Romanian.
When I was a kid, I'm much older than you. I never thought I'd go to Romania. I've been to Romania. I've been to Albania.
Yeah.
I see the trauma there.
Yeah.
And they are saying, they are screaming to us, what are you guys playing at? Like, this is so dangerous. Yeah. Communism is dangerous. We only crawled out in 1992, and we're barely scraping by here.
We found, that, and you start really understanding the oddities of the culture, right? It's like, how you say Saturday in sign language in Romanian? Because it's the only day they had water.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they could take a shower, So it's like you really understand the complexities of the trauma. And, one of the things that happened during that is that there was abortion was used as a form of birth control after the horrific, after the horrific reign of Ceausescu, So it was just so complex, And you really start understanding humanity from a really deep perspective.
Funny that your mom went to such a place of trauma to work through her trauma. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, it's very interesting. And now, now I can speak to my family from we all do this work. So
lovely.
My mother's deep into the constellation work. My dad has done it, which is beautiful. One of the most beautiful things I've ever experienced is like this gift from my father that he's done this.
And he was Venezuelan, right? So
yeah. And it's so, there's a lot of stuff there, right? And I now have this, they say you're ready to facilitate constellations when you heal the relationship with your mother and your father. And I'm so grateful that I'm there, that I have this just profound connection to both my parents.
Isn't that nice?
And love them,
alive.
And
yes, so this work can be done. I've had to reconcile with my mother after she passed.
Yeah.
And that's very,
Yeah.
I mean,
And
it's good, but it could have been, if it would have been earlier, then I would have known her and seen her in a new light, and I would have loved that. I can do that now, but I would have loved that.
yeah. And you can do both, you know, this work is it's so beautiful that it all has its own intricacies, right? And we're all in the place that we're supposed to be when we're ready for this work. And, you know, it's so, when you start seeing us as a cog in a long line of ancestry, we start understanding that we're everything that came before us. And if we have children, we can be the gatekeepers of that trauma for our children, right? It's like, we can start understanding it for our children's children, and we can be those generational gatekeepers that say, it stops with me. You no longer have to do this stuff out of loyalty to the family system. It's such a profound assumption of responsibility.
How you have devoted yourself to this.
I love it. I really do. It's so profound.
That's so interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about your work with the Circle of Brotherhood in Miami and the impact the organization is having on the community? So let's get back to like the present here.
So, thank you for the question. So the Circle of Brotherhood is an organization that started in Miami in I want to say 2011. And it was Black men in the Black community solving their own problems. That's what the Circle of Brotherhood talks about. And it started from the First 48. Are you familiar with the show, The First 48?
No.
So I think it's on A&E. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those cop reality shows, you know, law enforcement reality shows. And a ticker starts at like 48 hours, or it's either 48 hours or it starts at 0 until 48 hours. And they say that the statistically, crimes are, if not, they're not solved in the first 48 hours, the probabilities of being solved are drop out.
Right. It's like basically.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like a precipice of probability. Mm-hmm. And what ended up happening is that these guys the detectives saw this happening in this epicenter in Miami and Liberty City. And then they started doing this community involvement, and they got involved with a couple key community members, and it's secular. It's not politically affiliated with anybody. And they started doing exercise in the poor communities, which is one of the, main housing projects in the city. And they just started, getting involved with the community, right? Black men getting involved with the community. Well, now, 12 years later, it's this organization that we meet every Tuesday. And I've been invited in to be this guy that deals with unresolved trauma and family systems. And so, it's incredible. It's like, and, there's a lot of gentlemen that have been part of the program that were incarcerated for long periods of time. And it's like, have such profound insight and are so inspirational on the other side of what this looks like. And it's not because the system works, it's because they've done the work to be able to deal with whatever was ailing them in this trauma perspective. And so we've brought in this tool to say, now we can start healing with generational trauma, not as an excuse, but as an assumption of responsibility, right? It's like nowadays in culture, people are like, well, I have generational trauma. It's like, well, you can't drive around with your brakes messed up and start running into everybody saying, my brakes are broken. You have to deal with your brakes, right? So this weaponization or this excusing of like pop psychology is just infiltrated our society. And it's like, no, it's actually the 180 of that. If you're dealing with a narcissist, you have to understand why you're attracting a narcissist and what in you is resonating and being in a relationship with a narcissist. Yeah.
And and it's harsh reality, but life and death are very harsh. So you might as well.
It's just real. Yeah. And the victim perpetrator dynamic is like, when we understand the victim perpetrator is say the victim needs the perpetrator as much as the perpetrator needs the victim. That's such a harsh reality to say.
Yes, it is. It's very, very
harsh.
That's
so hard.
But you ought to look and see if there was just one grain of something that you may have done to make this happen. And that will bring gratitude. It'll bring forgiveness. It'll bring all kinds of things. Responsibility.
Yeah. And responsibility from the ability to respond. Yeah. And not be entangled by the subculture of your family system.
And all of this comes from an inability to act in a new way, like you're talking about, right? As soon as you have action in that way that is good, everything melts away. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what Constellation does. It creates the framing of where the family comes from. You can untangle the dynamic and say, this is the reality. And you acknowledge what is, and now we can put everybody in their place in the family system and create
I had
healing.
a grandfather who died at 56, cancer. When he married my grandmother, when he asked her to marry him, he said, if you don't marry me, I'm going to kill myself. And she married him. So he had lots of generational trauma. I don't know what happened in his family. And then when my grandmother died, she told me that she found my mom on the far corner of the property. And she shouldn't have been way out there, but she was afraid to come home. She said, you have to protect the children. So something had happened that she had kept to herself her whole life until she was on her deathbed. And so at least we know why my mom suffered so. Because it wasn't obvious to me. I didn't understand it.
And it usually isn't, right?
No.
It's like what I love to say is like when logic is not present, entanglement to unresolved trauma is.
Yes, that's what happens. Yeah, it's just like your memory. It's just like that little bit of hospital, glimmer of hospital that I got. There is something you need to attend to. There's a whole world there. But if it's just a little bit, then you're going to act in a strange manner because your brain is telling you to go there. You have to attend to this so it doesn't happen again, right?
Exactly. And when we acknowledge what is, we can now let it go.
Yeah.
That's it. It's as simple as that. And a lot of these, there's a lot of sexual abuse in my family system. There's just massive amounts of it. And so once we started understanding that, I'm like, I think that's a story that happens in many families. There's these patterns of abuse that happens in family over and over again. It's like, when we start understanding our culture from a lens of the systemic perspective, we can say, no wonder we're entangled in this victim perpetrator dynamic. No wonder we have these systemic vulnerabilities, and my triggers are my paths to healing.
I imagine this used to be done by the churches, didn't it?
It was, yes, absolutely. And it's like, Romans 12:2 says, do not conform to the patterns of this earth, but be renewed by the transforming of your mind. It's like this is, I think, very much so is that with our mental real estate, and I wrote something about this recently, it's like our mental real estate we've gained so much mental real estate that used to be taken up by running errands and, doing manual labor, that now the second order of business isn't survivability. It's this unresolved trauma that's underneath it. That's being taken. Now it's all getting triggered and getting opened up. And be like, this is a path to healing. This is our biggest opportunity that we have as a society to say, let's heal this so we can be stronger as a society rather than being activated by the victim perpetrator dynamic that will just continue to perpetuate the pattern.
So how do you see then the unresolved trauma and family system impacting our political movements and our well, you're talking about our culture, but what about the political movements?
Yeah, so I wrote this, and this resonated deeply in my family system. So I was having this conversation with my mom, and we were talking. She was very, very triggered by, or like in some word, activated by, the current right.
Right.
I'm like, this is a symptom, not necessarily a cause. Right? That we have this wounded father that's, in some capacity brash, and, it reminds me very much of my grandfather, right?
Reminds me of my father.
Exactly. Like that generation, right? It's like the wounded father, that generation of like, we don't talk about things. We suppress our emotions, and it has to be brash, and we have to do things by force. And now that mother, right? And now that mother has a wounded father is now a wounded mother that's overprotective and keeps you close and devours, right? And so it creates a son, which was in my case, right? And through family constellations, we healed this, that I was my mother's emotional partner, right? Yeah. So I was the man of the house. So I'm like her emotional because my father left because he didn't have an emotional connection with his family system. So now, like understanding the culture through my family lens, right? Obviously it's biased, but it resonates. It seems to resonate with people to look at it from that lens and say, we're transforming from the wounded father to the wounded mother, which is now what we're saying with this political movement to say, coddling or not assumption of responsibility, and it's everybody else's fault, is not mine, very much in the victim energy, right? Rather than being in the perpetrator energy. It's like really understanding that dynamic from that. And I'm like, of course we're doing this. This makes total sense from a systemic perspective, but it's so dangerous. It's such a dangerous thing because it repeats the pattern, and hopefully, 150 million people don't have to die for it to not repeat this pattern.
So what do you
again.
think about Trump and his, the people who have rallied around him, Elon Musk, RFK, Tulsi Gabbard, all these people? What do you think of that? Because that is as if it's not about Trump, particularly.
It's not.
It's about the people who are supporting him, and they are powerful people. It's very interesting.
I think I try to look at it for both from all perspectives, right? There's a reason why we're in this. And I try to find the reason why we're trying to solve this dynamic. And there's a big shift in our culture towards, like, crisis is opportunity, and always in my book. It's like we have this opportunity to heal and to continue the path of working through this to create dynamics. So I'm like grateful for Trump being this teacher, right? And I'm grateful for Vice President Harris for being this teacher, because showing us where we need to heal as a nation for both of the things that we have to do, right? It's like to continue to perpetuate this experiment that we're doing, right? It's like we have to learn, and we have to continue to learn. And much like a cigarette campaign, right? It's like we should have a national unresolved trauma campaign. It's like really understanding the depth of what unresolved trauma does, and be like, it's not an excuse. What happened to you is not your fault, but it's your responsibility to fix it, because nobody else can.
We have been doing that, only it's all been in terms of victimhood, not in terms of healing.
Yes, exactly. And, that difficult part is to say that if victims do not heal, they have a danger of creating perpetrators,
right?
Of becoming perpetrators. And that's the really hard part to do. And it might not be the same. It may be different, but it will run. It was inappropriate for my mother, that was, for all intents and purposes, a victim, to put me in a position that I was that emotional incest, that I was her emotional partner. Thank God that she found this, this healing modality that we all did, but we put together, but the damage was done, right? But I had to go through that to be able to create this narrative, or this conversation of being like, let's deal with the trauma rather than rejecting it. We need to integrate all of it.
Yeah, that, and really, my husband, that's partly what he's doing, right? He's saying to people, gently, kind of look at this, look at it very, very carefully. Where it's a thread, right? It's a thread. And you want to tug on that thread and find out where it came from.
Yeah. And, one of the things that we're doing with Circle of Brotherhood is, like, I think in some capacity, if you teach people how to deal with this, it can change the cultural dynamic of a society, right? It's like we can bring down the rates of abandonment, divorce, incarceration, violence throughout a culture, abortion, like it's like you look at it from all perspectives, right? And that everything has its place, that all of this are just lessons that we need to learn.
Right. Okay. So, one more question about you, what you do when you are, say there's a family that wants your services. How does that happen?
Yeah. So, we usually do workshops.
With how many
So if
people?
we get at least 10, like 8 to 12 people. We've done up to 55, right? That you can do a full week of family constellations that we're doing up, and it's deep.
So it's better over a week?
Slow. We could do a weekend or just a day. Here in Miami, there's a lot of people that do constellations, so we constantly have workshops happening, right? And we do constellations in Chicago as well. And there's a huge community of facilitators across the country. But if somebody were to say, hey, I'd like to do a constellation in this place, or they have a community that we'd like to bring constellations into, you literally put up a workshop. And as long as you have a space, it's like an AA meeting in some capacity, right? You sit in a circle and do some work, and it's very phenomenological. You do some work and you pull these things together, and it's very much of experience.
When you say phenomenological, what do you mean by that?
So we don't understand where this comes from, where this phenomenon comes from. There's some theories that I'm not going to I'm not going to talk about because it's, in the fringe of scientific,
Yeah,
right?
right.
It's starting to get, it's like, scientifically defining the Holy Spirit would be probably impossible, right? To understand that. So, but there is an emergent reality that comes in from when you put people in a circle and the entanglements in the family system
They do,
come
right?
up. And those are,
they do. Oh,
yeah, they're healed. It's one of the craziest things I've ever seen. And I'm very technical.
So you mean people will exhibit those behaviors that were dysfunctional in their families in this circle?
Yeah. So you literally pick representatives out of the
boy.
circle to represent mom,
Right.
dad, the child that wasn't born, and they may lay down, they may start, sobbing, they may hold each other, and you pull information from that. And Dan Booth Cohen has this book called Family Constellations in Prison, and did family constellations in Bay State Prison in Massachusetts with prisoners, with first degree murderers and rapists. And it's just like such a beautiful book that you really understand the depths of humanity and the range of the human spirit, that people that were, and that's what the Circle Brotherhood does for me, is like, it just creates this such hope and inspiration for the human spirit, right? That you can be.
Yeah, because you see that there is healing no matter what.
And in whatever scenario. It's like you can be in the depths of a prison. And, what they were saying, the participants that were talking about this book, and he has a peer review paper on this. He was talking about how it was one of the most sacred places they'd ever been. And they were in the, the bowels of this prison, in the sacred space that was happening in humanity.
It's so
it's just
dark
like,
there.
It's so dark there, and it's so beautiful to see that,
like
even in that
the
dynamic.
light is so bright because it's only just a tiny light. Yeah.
And it's just like, that's what this inspires me to do this, to continue to do this work, because it's so, I do believe that we have, call it the Holy Spirit, call it the universe, call it source, whatever you want to call it, that we all are connected in some capacity, that we all are
so
divine.
you have lots of opportunity to do this throughout your life.
Thank you.
That's so good.
Thank you.
What
I've taken this on my life mission.
Well,
sorry to interrupt.
So far, we'll see where it goes, because, we'll see where it goes. But you have a vision. Yeah. You have a vision, and you got to have a vision. Otherwise, you don't see where to take your next right step.
Yeah.
So what topics do you tackle on ZuluOne podcast? You have a podcast, and what experiences have you had hosting it?
So we talk about family constellations, right? In many capacities.
I'm going to look at your podcast.
Yeah. So I'm very
interested in this.
Yeah, we talk about, and I do it in English and Spanish. So I try to get as many people as possible. And we talk about different modalities in family constellations, because the constellations has taken on, I call it pre-yoga. It's the yoga of the 1980s, right? It's like it's becoming a movement. And it's really at the precipice of it really exploding nationally, right? Because you start hearing in the language. There's a Disney movie called Encanto. There's a Disney movie that, I know the Disney movies have taken a lot of
bad turns,
kind of odd, bad turns, right? But this movie talks about unresolved trauma and family systems. It's a movie that does an animation of unresolved trauma and how they heal the different daughters take on different things. And we don't talk about Bruno. Have you heard that song? We don't talk about Bruno.
Maybe.
It's the excluded one in the family system. So you start really, when you put these things together, they start these guys are talking about unresolved trauma in family systems. It's like how these patterns repeat themselves. And so we talk about these dynamics and how to pull apart unresolved trauma in family systems. And Michelle Bleckner.
Family constellations?
So, they're all over the world. The government of, they're very big in Europe. The government of Brazil uses that as a mediation process and divorces. They're really all over the world. And there's books. Mark Wollin's book, It Didn't Start With You, has been pretty popular. There's, Dan Booth Cohen, like I talked about, there's a lot of literature and peer review paper that are coming out of this work. And on the ZuluOne podcast, we talk about that dynamic in many capacities and do deep dive interviews with that. So we start off with the meditation, a lot like this conversation,
that meditation is very good.
and yeah. And that's a systemic meditation, right? Like understanding where our position is in our family system and aligning to that.
Right.
So that meditation is one of the examples of the work
I like that they're behind you. Right. So that's the focus. You are attending that the vision is having your family behind you and that you're at the forefront.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have we can always, Michelle Bleckner is a dear friend of mine, and she says that our ancestors are overstaffed and underworked, right? And that we can always call on that support system behind us. And I do a podcast with her, and she did Family Constellations with Tony Robbins, right? Is teaching Tony and Sage, about family constellations and how this work happens. And she was at one of Tony's events. It's like the platinum, so one of the one of the groups. And she was doing the family constellation, and they said, raise your hand if you've ever heard about constellations. And out of 600 people, 2 people raised their hand. And the 2 people had done constellations in Michelle's living room here in Miami. So this work is at that precipice of becoming extraordinarily popular.
Oh, wow. That's very interesting. I'm so excited about it. So how do you juggle between being a podcast host, a CEO, and a father?
I try to make all of it work in one place. Right. It's the podcasting. Some of it all has to suffer. Right. But, my main job is I run a company. We do IT and cybersecurity.
I see.
Right. That's what we do. And that's my day job. Right.
And is that what you did in the military?
Being a father.
Or is that?
No, I was a jet engine mechanic in the military.
Oh, engine mechanic. I see.
Yeah. So I'm very technical. Right. And I like how systems work. So I like to fix things, basically. Yeah. So it's very much in line with my temperament, but I try to.
And you see now that what's calling is family constellations.
And I combine all of it into one, because I'm the same person that I take to work is the same person that I take to being a father, and the same person that I take to constellations. And the more that I work on me, the more I connect with my intuition, the more unresolved trauma I'm taking off of that core alignment of who I am, and the more present I'll be.
So what about your children?
It all aligns.
Do they need to go through this process too? Will they need to go through this process?
So in family constellations, parents can do constellations for children until they're emancipated, because they're still under their guidance and responsibility, right? Once they're emancipated, they leave the house. And you can, as a parent, say, can I ask your permission to do a constellation for you? And you can do that, right? But my son, and this is very personal, but we'll talk about it. My son had some issues that he was dealing with. And, it was like my wife and I were talking about it, and we were trying to figure out where it was coming from. And I ended up doing a workshop dealing with my own demons, right? With my own stuff. And he was manifesting in some capacity those dynamics. And the more that I worked on my stuff, it literally disappeared.
They mirror us. They mirror us, those little kids.
Exactly.
They look to us. I mean, I have this little grandson who's only 10 months old, and he'll move like an inch and then look at me. Right? And move in and look at me.
Yeah.
Because he's finding out what he's doing. And he's taking the cues from where I am.
And there's such good vessels of uncovering what's happening in the family system, right? And that we literally read, their behavior as clues to where we need to feel. That's the work that we're doing as parents, And the more my wife and I work on our relationship, and the more we're present, and the more we're dealing with our demons, and the more we're doing stuff. And, somebody told me one time, is like, the best gift that you can give your children is to love their mother.
Yeah. Right. And love each other. Yeah. Really. Yeah.
Yeah. And you see this in divorce so many times, that people are like talking, horribly about their parents. Like, you're literally in front of their kids. Like, you're literally talking about 50% of their DNA. They're talking about half of them. Even if you've chosen to have that separation, it's like, you can still, from a meta perspective, be grateful and love their mother for giving you these gifts. And out of woundedness, we just repeat these patterns, and people don't even know where to start.
So how long is this process then for an average person to find some peace
So, what happens is usually a workshop is a couple
Yeah.
hours, right? So we'll do 4 hours, and we'll do, or it's a whole day process, and people will get picked out of the circle to do work. But the movement can happen between 6 months to 2 years.
Isn't that
It can be immediate, and the movement you can even see effects 2 years later. And it's so effective that you just start seeing, like, have you ever cleaned a fish bowl?
Yep.
And all the sediment is floating around, and then it settles after a while. It's much like that, like a deep healing process. You're like kind of wonky for a couple of days, but then it settles into its new place, and those dynamics disappear.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Because they're no longer serving
right
us.
now.
We grow out of those patterns. Whenever you want to do it, I'm available. So
let's see.
And it's really good to do with strangers, just like people that don't necessarily know each other. So
yeah, that's why it's good to have a real group of 8 or so, 10 people.
Yeah, exactly. And you have just a random group of people that can all come together, and you come as strangers and you leave as like soul family in some odd way.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we talked about
Venezuela. So, Tammy, can I ask you?
Go ahead.
Can I ask you a question? So, what's the portion of this that resonates most with you of what we talked about?
Well, I think I was a yoga teacher. I was a massage therapist for years. So I touched people. I felt their pain. I can find their pain, right? And who knows where that started from? It could have been generational pain.
Yeah.
So I also, I had my own upbringing. I was the youngest, and so I really wanted to understand that inner. It's called an inner. It's some sort of pact you've made with your future.
Oh, yeah.
And I wanted to understand. I guess I have always known I did that. And so there was always something between my mom and my dad and I, and even my sisters and I. Like every time I'd get together with my sisters, we'd fight. We'd argue. And when we got older, my oldest sister started to show signs of dementia, and I was like, I don't want to argue. I just want to love to be there, And my husband said, just listen. And she had so much trauma that she'd never talked about, and she started telling me these things, and I didn't say anything. I just listened, and I was so surprised. She went back to a time when I was only in high school, and I was in junior high actually. And she was a young woman, and her fiance died in a car crash. And she was hurt. She was hurt, and she looked at me, and I wasn't hurt. And that stayed with her, because I don't know, it was never shared, And after that, we had 20 years together. That was good. It happened twice. She told me the same story twice about how I had never done anything on my own or anything. So she was talking to me as if I was a little kid. And at the end of that, she said, but you're a good mother. So it was very strange, right? It was this past thing. And then she would look at that and think, well, that's not true. You're a good mother. But right? It's like this.
Yeah. It can be all the above, right?
Why do I do this? Because I understand it. I have good intuition about people. I've always had good intuition from the time I can walk into rooms and say, those two are married, and people say, no, they're not. I'm like, and a year later they are. They've left their spouses and they're married, and I know nothing about them. So this makes me curious. What kind of
this might be a tool that completes your tool set, that if you're very much in the somatic, right, in the body experience, that you can do that. And that's what yoga and massage therapy is, right? Like you're moving in some capacity, whether that's pain or energy or whatever you want to, Mickey Mouse, whatever you want to call it, right? That you can move that through the bodies. You can really understand that intuition of connecting with that resonance.
Yeah, I worked with an osteopath, and I felt something here, and I thought maybe that's my grandfather. And so I went back to Scotland. I know there was a church he was born in. I went back there and I forgave him for any misunderstandings that we have because of his behavior, and forgave him because he was also doing his best to struggle through life. Yeah, and that was helpful.
Yeah, and that's on your
My
father's
mom's
side?
My mom's side.
On your mom's side. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what happened with my father really. He was actually pretty good. He drank too much and he was very boisterous, but he was a good man. Like he stayed with my mother, and when she got dementia, he took care of her until she was in her last months of life. Like he really, and people said, no, your dad wouldn't do that. And I'm like, yeah, he did. It was hard to know who he was deep down because he was a complex person.
Yeah, we usually are, right?
That's right. And then his mother, I know my daughter did our genetics, and we can go back to nearly the 15th century on his mother's side.
Oh, that's incredible.
Coverdales, and they had lots of babies, and they, prospered. And so that was my dad's mother. So they actually had a pretty good genetic history. And so he benefited from that.
Yeah.
But he married my mom for a reason.
There's so much power
for some reason, right? Yeah. Kind of a wounded mother, mother.
That's, in many capacities, we find partners of where we're trying to heal, right? And that's like such an interesting dynamic because it gives us this opportunity to be like, you're going to find a partner. And if you don't solve it with this one, you're going to probably be in the same thing with the next one. And if you don't solve with this one, you're going to probably be in the next one.
Yeah, I can see that. And I can see that in my family.
Yeah, that happens. I was talking to one of my friends, and he's like, he would go through this 5-year cycle with this woman. And, I was like, and he started to get into Constellations, started doing this stuff. And I'm like, don't worry. If you don't figure it out with her, you're going to figure it out with the next one. Very, as a man, very practical, be like, don't worry, and giving them a little tough love to say, if you don't figure it out with her, you're going to figure it out with the next one. And if not that one, the next one. But each one, you're going to leave a pound of flesh back, right? You're going to leave that part of your soul back and doing that dynamic. And most people are just walking around like hurt little kids, right? Of wherever they were arrested emotionally as children. And the earlier that is, the more, egocentric and broken they are when you're a child. And he's like, we weaponize this term narcissism all the time. He's like, well, narcissism could be translated into somebody who was a broken 3-year-old, right? That they were running around like a 3-year-old that didn't get their needs met, excuse me. Yeah. And they're running around like a wounded little child.
They are, because it's all about me all the time right now. Yeah. That's a very tiny child. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you start looking at people from that perspective, just judgment goes away, right? And you should be like, I understand you. I now understand. And that's like, in this work we were talking about, forgiveness is such a powerful term, right? It's like, I'm no one to forgive. Forgiveness is between you and your creator. What I can do is I can have an opinion, and I can either have an opinion of getting close or getting farther away, but I can work to understand you. Because from understanding, we can integrate and consent. We can integrate with feeling, right? Not just from an intellectual place, but from, from the soul, right? I can really understand you. Like, I don't agree with what you did, but I can understand.
Yes. So we're in a strange place in the States, in Canada. Strange places. Yeah. And people are trying to figure out who to vote for. And in Canada, we're trying to figure out how we can get to a vote, because so far that's been, eluding us. And for some reason, we're in these places politically.
I think that it's, like I said before, I think it's a symptom. It's a huge opportunity. It's a humongous opportunity. The Venezuela was very much in the victim-perpetrator dynamic. The rise of Hitler comes from, the humiliation of World War I, right? It's like you have to have Carl Jung said this again. It's like that Hitler was the voice of the collective subconscious of 78 million Germans. That the crowd had Hitler as much as Hitler had the crowd. It's like that's where the danger of perpetratorship, like this victim-perpetrator dynamic comes from. The Communist Manifesto talks about the same thing. It's like us versus them, the Cain and Abel dynamic, that I've been hurt, so I will hurt other, and whatever it takes to do that. It comes from that entangled judgment that that is profound and dangerous and dark, and that just only serves to perpetuate the pattern.
Right. And then through a couple of days of going to a family constellation, you can uncover those things.
100%.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
that sounds necessary.
It is. That's my mission, is to get, this work out to as many people as possible and educate people
And how are you doing that?
through writing podcast, the ZuluOne podcast, joining, these conversations. I've built some relationships on X, with people that are pretty interesting, to say, I'm here to educate people as much as possible on the dangers of unresolved trauma and social and cultural systems.
Yeah.
That these are just patterns that we're repeating, and to work with a circle of brotherhood. And this is my goal, to do this with as many people as possible without judgment.
So are you mostly in Florida?
I'm based out of Florida.
Do you just stay there? Is that where your work is done?
So I travel. The company that I run is nationwide, and I travel nationwide for that work. And my sister and mother live in Chicago, so I do Constellations in Chicago, and then people that have invited us to do Constellations. But Miami is one of those cities that you can get to anywhere very quickly.
True.
That's why it's very convenient. We can straight flight to, yeah. It's a major metropolitan area that we can have those conversations. I recently spoke at Miami-Dade College about this work about unresolved trauma and family systems. It was a Hope for Tomorrow, childhood and teen suicide prevention. Mm-hmm. And it's like, really, when you start putting things into context of unresolved trauma, you start understanding how, these are manifestations of that victim perpetrator dynamic, whether it's a 10 or a 2, whatever magnitude that is or intensity that is, it's all repeating patterns of these things. And I struggled with that. I understand completely where that comes from.
Good. That's very interesting. I'm thinking we're going up to see my husband's father, his mother has passed away and his father is frail in a wheelchair. And so we're going to go up, and I know him very well. Like, he was my school teacher in grade 5. And
oh, wow.
And Jordan was in my classroom from the time he was in grade 3.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So we grew up together, Jordan and I. And his father was part of that growing up. And Jordan loves his father. He admires his father. He respects his father. But there is a lot of trauma there.
It's a big shift.
It would be very nice to have some movement there.
Yeah, that's a big shift. Yeah, what part of Canada?
Peace River country, like really north of Edmonton.
Like Alberta?
Yes.
Yeah, my mother was stationed in Calgary.
Oh, okay. No, it's Fairview. It's like 700 miles north or something. It's way.
Oh, wow. Yeah, we went to Banff National Park. It's like, what a beautiful place. It's just such a beautiful, wonderful, incredible.
Well, I left Alberta when I moved to Montreal, and I realized I left the mountains, and my heart hurt when I left. I was leaving people, right? I was going out on my own. And then I thought, but I left the mountains. I love the mountains.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's such an incredible place.
It is. And it's doing good political work there too. There's something that's healing and good in Alberta right now again. So that's good to see for the country. The country needs that kind of sign.
And, one of the things that's so encouraging is that over years, we figure it out in some capacity, right? We always figure it out. And whether it's through the religious experience, whether it's through deep trauma work, whether through it, whatever it is that gets you there, right?
Yeah, you're right.
We heal it in some capacity. We heal it. And this is just another phase of that process, right? That we do it. I'm so encouraged about, we wouldn't be having this conversation. If we were doomed, we wouldn't be having, this conversation to be like,
about healing.
About healing. Exactly. And so many people are ready for it. And it's bubbling up to the surface. And we're having such interesting conversations from all spectrums, from the polka dots to the stripes, to the plaids, to the, everybody's having those conversations.
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
And it's I'm so encouraged. I'm so hopeful and encouraged. And I know that once we break these patterns, we won't have to repeat the past.
Mm-hmm. That's something to look forward to.
Yeah.
We could pray about that, couldn't we?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming on my podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I had a super time talking to you.
Likewise.
Really.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
And
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So I hope we can cross paths again. Thank you very much.